Why not call all countries by the names they call themselves? Like, why aren't we calling India Bharat or Japan Nippon? I get Spanish-speaking countries saying Estados Unidos because United States are words with meaning, but other countries have names. And it would be weird to call someone else a different name than they call themselves. One, local language names' endonyms often contain sounds that don't exist or are hard to pronounce in other languages. 2, do we call it what the locals call it now, or what they called it when English speakers first became aware of it? 3, what do we do if the inhabitants of a place speak different languages or don't agree themselves on what it should be called? They're in languages we don't know, sometimes written in scripts we can't read, using sounds we can't always pronounce. Plus, language is for the speaker. We spend far more time talking about other countries to each other than we do talking to them. I wouldn't want foreigners butcher the name by trying to pronounce Österreich. If you want to call Hungary Magyar Őrség, you go for it. But even if you could pronounce it, would anyone know what you were talking about? India is called India in languages spoken in southern India. I have never met anyone in India using the word Bharat in casual conversations. We used to not even call people by their names in their own languages. We only started doing that with people from the modern era. Do you think Christopher Columbus went by the name Christopher? Or that a dude named Mark wrote part of the Bible? Most places I know of where we use different names for it in Portuguese. It's because we've called it that a very long time. Before globalization or anything of the sort. Especially for European countries. We've called them different names than their own people for centuries. But even newer states, we tend to make their names easier to pronounce in our own language and use our alphabet. Most people can't even differentiate Deutschland and Dutch Netherlands. I wouldn't trust them to know or pronounce things like Deutschland or Koninkrijk der Nederlanden. Like, why aren't we calling India Bharat or Japan Nippon? Why are you calling Japan Nippon and not Ri-ben or Ri-ben Guo? India has hundreds of languages. Hrvatska joined the conversation. There are 5 official ways to call Switzerland Su. Because butchering names in some misguided attempt at decolonization without speaking the language makes communication more difficult, not easier. At least with the name you use in your own language correctly pronounced, we all know what you are talking about. It would be even more confusing if we translated those names. Imagine how confused Americans would be to find out they're next door to the United Mexican States and Village. Let's see how many of them can place the Savior, Sunrise Island, Middle Kingdom, People's Land and Silver Republic on a map. There are many languages, not only English. So many different names for countries in different languages. United States are words with meaning. Boy, do I have some news for you. Because that's fucking stupid. If you don't speak a language, then don't pretend you do so. It's not set in stone. We recently at last got other countries to rename us from White Russia to Belarus. So whenever country wants, it can rename itself in other languages. It does take 30 years for the old grumpy people who refuse to change the name in their head to die off. I get Spanish-speaking countries saying Estados Unidos because United States are words with meaning. Your answer is in here somewhere. I'm Irish. Ireland in our native language Gaeilge is Éire. It actually annoys me when people refer to Ireland as Éire, especially British printed media. Dunno why. It is our name. But it irritates me for some reason. Just prefer Ireland to be called Ireland. We can't even agree to call people by the names they call themselves. Not an answer to your question, but Indians call India India as well as other names, but that's a different story. That whole kerfuffle was orchestrated by the Gov to cover up some other shady shot going on in our country. But I agree. Decolonize woman dancing medium skin tone. Can someone explain to me why this question is just out in the zeitgeist now? I see it everywhere here. Twitter, TikTok. To me it seems obvious that different people speak different languages. And yet, it is apparently not obvious to many other grown adults. Does anyone have a theory on why that is? I feel like it must be related somehow to social justice concerns, nothing about us without us, etc. But I can't quite fill in the whole picture. Because we're speaking English. Nihon Nippon isn't even correct because it's spelled Ri-ben and most English speakers don't know how to read that. And the name Japan has the same etymology as Nippon anyways. It was just borrowed into English a long time ago across a bunch of different languages. Exonyms and endonyms aren't exclusive to English either. In Vietnamese, Japan is Nyat Ban, also spelled Ri-ben, which ultimately has the same origin as both Japan and Nippon, even though it's spelled different in the Latin script. Because languages have distinct grammar rules and sounds. Think for example of Spain. España in Spanish. The new is not a sound in the English language. You could go on with Croatia Hrvatska, Canada Kannada, Germany Deutschland, and so much more. Additionally, most countries are not monolingual, not even microstates like Monaco. For example, France has multiple native languages. Would you say Brocahal Breton or Franco-Occitan in English? Some countries, especially artificial countries like many in Africa, have dozens if not hundreds of ethnic groups. Which group should decide what's their country's name should be? Well, some countries don't even stick to one way of calling themselves. For example, Japan. Not only do they actually use Japan internally, they also use Nihon instead of Nippon. Countries do actually agree to what other countries call them. I derve you to pronounce Hrvatska. For languages that use a lot of inflection, e.g. Slavic languages, that may be really awkward to use the original name in a sentence, and it may need some modifications to be compatible with the language. I have always wondered the same thing. Extra benefit? We are now exposed to different languages, which may help learning languages in the future. Since our brains sort of filter out sounds we do not use, couldn't this prevent it? Calling India Bharata is a politically loaded term, FYI. Because no American would pronounce Sverige Sweden right. That's not how languages work. 'Cause some of them would be difficult to pronounce. Try to pronounce Magai Erzig. Well, I can imagine that Deutschland is considerably harder to pronounce than Germany. Let's take India's Bharat. Now the foreign speakers wouldn't know how to pronounce it. Pretty sure a lot of them would pronounce it as Bharata instead of Bharata. Can you imagine the disaster it would be? That's why India is perfect. Short, sweet. Never heard a good argument for this. Sure, you might butcher names you don't have sounds for. But that's where accents come in. It doesn't mean you should just completely change it from Deutschland to Germany. Some languages have sounds that are extremely difficult for some other languages to mimic and impossible to write out in a different alphabet. Because when it comes to languages, you must consider that one, nativizing the pronunciation of a foreign name is prioritized, as opposed to simply integrating the endonym of another country. Different languages are governed by different rules, different sets of phonemes, different mindsets. 2. Etymology also comes into play. The history of how a country's name comes about is different for any given language. It isn't weird at all for exonyms to exist. It would be much weirder if names matched all the time, across all tongues. Do long as people know what you're taking about, it's fine. That's the point of language.